You're listening to Now It's the News. I'm Beowulf Rockland. This week, the world has been remembering George Herbert Walker Bush, the 41st President of the United States. And we're very lucky today to be talking with John Rothmann. He's a radio talk show host on KGO 810 AM in San Francisco. He's been a part of that station since 1996. He's a lecturer on American politics and the presidency and the author of Icon of Evil, Hitler's Mufti and the Rise of Radical Islam, as well as heralding Stassen, the life and perennial candidacy of the progressive Republican. John, good to speak with you again. Thanks so much for being with us on Now It's the News.
My pleasure.
James Baker, the former Secretary of State, recently told the New York Times history is beginning to recognize that George Bush was the best one-term president in American history. How do you assess George H.W. Bush's presidency?
Actually, the first time I heard that line was from George W. Bush at his father's state funeral.
Yeah.
Look, George H.W. Bush was a man who led his party, led his country, did the very best he could, was an honorable, decent man. I have to confess I never voted for George H.W. Bush, but I have to tell you that death brings out the best. That is to say, all you hear are the positives. Generally, in presidential polls, George H.W. Bush ranks in about the middle. Will he go up now that he's dead? You know something? Whenever you die, people only say nice things about you. There's a lot of controversy about George H.W. Bush, but there's also a lot of good things to be said. Will he rank as the best one-term president? We've had a lot of one-term presidents who did remarkably well over the years, so I would suggest that he certainly deserves consideration more for the fact of the time he served, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the tearing down of the Berlin Wall, those major events. And by the way, to his great credit, the way he handled those events will ring through history.
Well, you are, of course, a gentleman, but this is not necessarily a gentlemanly age in which we observe the passing of George H.W. Bush. Some on the left certainly have accused the media of glossing over some of the more controversial aspects of his presidency. The Willie Horton ad.
That's true. It's not just the left that does that.
Right.
There are many on the right. Remember that George H.W. Bush was challenged by Pat Buchanan.
Yes.
There was who really waged a very strong race. I have to say, so you understand this, the wound of his death is such that everyone accentuates the positive.
Yeah.
I can enumerate for you the negatives about George H.W. Bush, and that's the reason why he does not rank higher in the rating of presidents.
And do you think that perhaps now, because we are observing his passing, because we see the funeral on television, because there is this period of mourning, that there's some holding back, and that perhaps a more sober assessment will come to us later on?
Beowulf, of course that's going to be the case. I mean, what you heard are all of the people who loved him, and that's what you should hear at a funeral. Were there difficulties in the George H.W. Bush administration? You bet. Read my lips, no new taxes. The selection of Dan Quayle as his running mate. The very rocky relationship that the Bush administration had with Israel. The considerable difficulty that Bush had with his own political party. It's interesting. Did you know that George H.W. Bush was once the president of Planned Parenthood in Texas?
I did
and
not.
Then did a complete flip and became one of the staunchest advocates for the pro-life position.
Wow.
There are inconsistencies in his career that also are real. But I'll never forget going to a funeral once where, as they walked down the stairs, somebody turned to me and said, "He was a son of a bitch, but he was our son of a bitch." and I think that summarizes when Jimmy Carter dies, when Gerald Ford passed away, when Ronald Reagan passed away. The criticisms diminish. One of the great problems that the legacy of George H.W. Bush will present was the Willie Horton ad, which certainly for a decent, honorable man, as George H.W. Bush certainly was a black mark.
Right.
And he permitted it. There are a variety of issues involved. One thing we can know, and that is that the people who knew him best loved him.
Right.
That is not true with some people who have served in the Oval Office. One other quick comment, if I may. Donald Trump attended the funeral.
Right.
I want to remind you he did not attend. He wasn't invited to Barbara Bush's funeral,
right,
nor was he invited to John McCain's funeral. In fact, he was disinvited there. The simple truth is that what the death of George H.W. Bush did was to allow the country to contrast the temperament, the style,
right,
the way a president should act. One of the most remarkable things about George H.W. Bush was that he knew the name of all the White House employees. He greeted them by name. He knew their families. He felt the same way about the Secret Service. You remember one of his Secret Service agents' children had leukemia.
That's
and,
right.
George H.W. Bush shaved his head.
Right.
He was a good, honest, compassionate man. You can disagree on issues, but I think that the truth of the matter, whether you are a Trump supporter or not, is that if you were looking for the anti-Bush, that is the exact opposite of George H.W. Bush in terms of the presidency, it would be Donald Trump.
And we certainly are seeing him benefit from that comparison. I agree that he was an honorable man. He was polite, someone who worked with both sides, certainly, and somebody who was agreeable. I wonder if our standards have changed because of the current occupant of the Oval Office, and whether someone who met the standards in what was, in his time, an expected way, receives an additional bonus, essentially just for not being Donald Trump.
You hit the nail on the head. Exactly right. And let me say, because I know you have a broad variety of listeners, some who applaud Donald Trump, some who don't, that I was a Republican for many years. I became a Democrat some years ago over policy issues. As a former Republican, as I was president of the Teenage Republicans in San Francisco, and I was the youngest member of the Republican State Central Committee, and I worked for Richard Nixon, as you know, for many years, I consider Donald Trump to be, well, not only dysfunctional, but a disgrace. And on every level, if this were a critique of Donald Trump, whether it has to do with his honesty, his obstruction of justice, his corruption, I mean, it is so pervasive, in my judgment, that it almost we've almost decided we can't handle it all.
Yeah,
it's like a juggler, Beowulf, juggling 3 balls, 4 balls, 5 balls. In this case, if you interviewed me for days, I could go through the problems I have with Donald Trump, not because he's Donald Trump. Do you understand?
Yes.
But because of the way he conducts himself, his presidency. It's an absolute disgrace. Now, having said that, and that's just John Rothmann's opinion, which listeners can accept or reject, understand that the reason there is such emphasis on George H.W. Bush is because he was a good, honest, decent man whose opponents didn't like his policies but never said a negative thing about his person. And that's the stark contrast.
We're speaking with John Rothmann. He's a radio talk show host on KGO 810 AM in San Francisco. I think it's also interesting to note some of the other reactions. You had recently in the New York Times an article by Ross Duhat about George H.W. Bush's role as a WASP. And he waxed nostalgic about the age in which presidents and senators and great men were WASPs. That interests me, and I saw a number of people online react, I think rightly, negatively to that. Perhaps the author was referring to a certain highborn style as opposed to literally being a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. But I think that there are a lot of misconceptions about what the benefits were of being ruled, so to speak, by a class of that particular sort of individual. What's your response to that take?
Well, the first thing is no president rules.
True.
Period. I think that's very important. Number two, every president is a reflection of their background. John Fitzgerald Kennedy was a Catholic, Boston bred, Harvard educated. He represented a rejection, some said, of WASP America. Quite the contrary. What America offers is the opportunity for anyone from any ethnic group to rise to the top. There is no question that George H.W. Bush, because of his father Prescott and because of the heritage of his family, had advantage throughout his life. It's also true that the fact that he was part of the WASP establishment, a high church Episcopalian, I don't think it really mattered. I think he was judged in his time. And remember, in 1988, Ronald Reagan, had he been able to run for a third term, would have been reelected, despite the Iran-Contra scandal, for instance. George H.W. Bush represented a continuation of the Reagan legacy, maybe even in the view of many a third term for Ronald Reagan. And there were a lot of reasons why he represented that kind of patrician America.
Yeah.
And there will be others who will come along. Donald Trump certainly doesn't represent patrician America.
He certainly doesn't, although literally he is a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, to the extent that you can say those things literally, but he doesn't represent the patrician establishment of the United States.
Nor does he represent well, if you think about it, he couldn't even recite the Apostles' Creed. He didn't know it. Now, I say that as a nice Jewish boy. I can tell you that when you look hard at Barack Obama, who was the antithesis of what George H.W. Bush represented in America. But I want to tell you the ultimate irony, and it's something nobody's really reflected on. Both George H.W. Bush, 41, and his son, George W. Bush, 43, voted for Hillary Clinton for president.
Yeah.
And that tells you a lot about the fact that the establishment didn't embrace Donald Trump because of what Donald Trump represents.
Yeah.
And it's the antithesis of civility, of honesty, of integrity.
Yeah.
Which was the symbol. And there's another point to be made, I think, and that is about the Republican Party itself. Donald Trump has done tremendous damage to the Republican Party.
Yes.
We saw it in the congressional campaign just completed, where almost 10 million more Americans voted for the Democrats than for the Republicans. There is, I think, a concern within the Republican Party that the leadership of the party, and I want to remind you that bitter political rivals, Bob Dole and George H.W. Bush, were both chairs of the Republican Party.
Right.
That the Republican Party of the era of Dole and Bush is gone.
Yeah.
And one of the things that will happen, the Republican Party will have to redefine itself, not in the shadow of an incumbent president. By the way, very similar to what the Republican Party had to do when Richard Nixon left the presidency. Nixon was the quintessential Republican. I would remind you when they speak about the Republicans gaining 40 seats in the, the Democrats gaining 40 seats in the congressional race that just completed, that when Richard Nixon in 1966 campaigned around the country, the Republican Party gained 47 seats and put Nixon on the path to the nomination in 1968. Hey, look, there are many historical connections to be drawn, but the bottom line is that George H.W. Bush will be remembered as a good, honorable, decent man with whom you could disagree on certain issues, who had within his own administration certain scandals. Let me remind you, we're coming up on Christmas Eve in a few weeks, that it was on Christmas Eve of 1992, 1992, as George H.W. Bush was leaving office, that he pardoned Caspar Weinberger.
That's right.
I mean, there are many things that one can discuss legitimately, and those critiques of the late former president will no doubt emerge in the days ahead.
And I would just note before we move on that certainly, having mentioned your roots in the Republican Party, that there are certainly many folks that I work with directly, including former RNC Chairman Michael Steele, who are, to say the least, ambivalent about the direction that the current Republican Party, under the leadership of Donald Trump, is taking. There are many. It is certainly a divided party, and there are many real conservatives who have